We're going to be starting on chapter 14. This is the autonomic nervous system. So we're going to start by looking at comparing the somatic and the autonomic nervous systems. So first we have the somatic nervous system. This includes both sensory and motor neurons. Remember that the sensory neurons convey input from receptors for somatic sensations. So these are going to be like tactile or touch, thermal, pain, and also proprioceptive receptors. Sensory neurons are also going to convey input from receptors of the special senses. So things like sight, hearing, smell, and taste. These are all going to be the special senses. All of these senses are normally consciously perceived. And then the motor neurons of the somatic nervous system are going to innervate skeletal muscles. When a somatic motor neuron stimulates a muscle, it contracts. The effect is always excitation. Now, if a somatic motor neuron ceases to stimulate a muscle, the result is a paralyzed limb muscle that has no muscle tone. So this is always going to be the case with the somatic nervous system. So if a motor neuron stimulates a muscle, it contracts. The effect is always going to be excitation. Then, on the other hand, we have the autonomic nervous system. Now this receives input from autonomic or visceral sensory neurons. Now mostly these neurons are associated with enteroreceptors or interoceptors. So remember, interoceptors are going to be sensory receptors that are located in blood vessels, in visceral organs, muscles, and the nervous system. They're really going to be the nervous system that monitors conditions in the internal environment. Now, chest pain due to inadequate blood flow to the heart would be an example of a perceived visceral sensation. Now, autonomic motor neurons regulate visceral activities by either increasing or decreasing the activities of their effector tissues. Now, when they increase activities, this is by exciting them. So increasing activities, this is going to be by excitation. And when we decrease activities of the effectors, this is by inhibition. Now with autonomic motor neurons, their effector tissues are all either going to be cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, or glands. So things like changes in the diameter of pupils, dilation and constriction of blood vessels, and even the adjustment of heart rate are examples of autonomic motor responses. Now, most autonomic responses cannot be consciously altered to any great degree. So you probably can't voluntarily slow your heartbeat to half of its normal rate. These are not things that we can consciously do. Now here we have an example of a somatic nervous system neuron. So remember that an axon of a single myelinated motor neuron is going to extend from the central nervous system the spinal cord here, all the way to the skeletal muscle fibers in its motor unit. So you're going to have one single motor neuron in the somatic nervous system. Now, by contrast, autonomic motor pathways are a little bit different. Most autonomic motor pathways consist of two motor neurons in a series, one after the other. So the first neuron, the preganglionic neuron, this has its cell body in the central nervous system, or the CNS. Its myelinated axon will extend from the central nervous system to an autonomic ganglion, a cluster of cell bodies. Now the cell body of the second neuron, the postganglionic neuron, this is also in that same autonomic ganglion, and then its unmyelinated axon extends directly from the ganglion to the effector. So what I was just talking about is the first example on the top here, where you have that preganglionic neuron, which is myelinated, synapsing with the postganglionic neuron, which is unmyelinated, and they synapse in the autonomic ganglion. Then that postganglionic neuron will extend to the effectors. Remember, like glands, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. Now, in some autonomic pathways, the first motor neuron extends to specialized cells, which are called chromaffin cells. And these are found in the adrenal medulla. Remember, this is going to be the inner portion of the adrenal gland. And they'll go to these chromaffin cells rather than the autonomic ganglion. The chromaffin cells will secrete neurotransmitters epinephrine and norepinephrine, which will go into the blood. Now, one thing of note is that all somatic motor neurons release only acetylcholine as their neurotransmitter. We learned that before, so we'll put this here. All somatic motor neurons secrete acetylcholine. So this is their neurotransmitter. But autonomic motor neurons, they can release either acetylcholine or norepinephrine. So acetylcholine or norepinephrine, I'll put as their neurotransmitter. And we'll kind of learn the differences and which ones secrete which a little bit later in this chapter. Now, unlike somatic motor output, the output part of the autonomic nervous system has two divisions. So these are the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division. Now, most organs have dual division. So what this means is that they receive impulses both from the sympathetic and parasympathetic neurons. So let's learn a little bit about the differences between the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. So first off, the sympathetic division is often called the fight or flight division. And this is because it results in increased alertness and increased metabolism. Responses to some situations that activate the sympathetic division may result in things like rapid heart rate, dry mouth, dilation of the pupils, sweaty and cool skin, dilation of blood vessels to organs involved in combating stress. So this would be like increase in blood flow to the heart and skeletal muscles, things that are going to help you either fight or flee. The sympathetic division will also cause constriction of blood vessels to organs not involved in combating stress. So we're going to decrease blood flow to areas like the gastrointestinal tract and the kidneys. The parasympathetic division is often referred to as the rest and digest division. And this is because its activities conserve and restore body energy during times of rest or when you're digesting a meal. Now, the majority of output is going to be directed to smooth muscle and glandular tissue of the gastrointestinal and respiratory tract. Now here's a really good table that shows the differences between the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. It shows the different neurotransmitters that are used, the different pathways, different motor neuron pathway, the different effectors, and also the different responses that they elicit. So really good for studying those differences between the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system here. Now each division of the autonomic nervous system has two neurons. The first of the two motor neurons in any autonomic pathway is called the preganglionic neuron. Now its cell body is in the brain or spinal cord, so its cell body is going to be in the central nervous system, and its axon will exit the central nervous system as part of a cranial or spinal nerve. The axon of the preganglionic neuron is usually very small in diameter, and it's also myelinated. It's going to extend usually to an autonomic ganglion. And at the autonomic ganglion, this is where it synapses with the postganglionic neuron. This is going to be the second neuron in the autonomic pathway. And the postganglionic neuron has its cell body and dendrites located within that autonomic ganglion. And the postganglionic neuron can actually synapse with one or more preganglionic axons. So let's first talk about the sympathetic division here. So in the sympathetic division, the preganglionic neurons have their cell bodies in the lateral horns of the gray matter, in the 12 thoracic segments, and the first 2 lumbar segments of the spinal cord. So this is an important little section here. Now, for this reason, the sympathetic division is also called the thoracolumbar division. And this is because all of those preganglionic neurons are located either in the thoracic or the lumbar segment of the spinal cord. So here we can see those sympathetic ganglions. So this is going to be the sympathetic division here. We can see the preganglionic neurons are going to have a solid line, whereas the postganglionic neurons have kind of this dashed blue line. So we can tell those apart on this picture. So we can see from T1 down to L2 or L3, sometimes L2, sometimes L3, so just take note with that. we're going to see these preganglionic neurons coming here, going out to the sympathetic trunk ganglia. This is found on both sides of the spinal cord, and this is going to be that it's going to be those areas, the sympathetic ganglia, or the autonomic ganglia, sorry, that we get those synapses between the pre and postganglionic neurons. Now, a single sympathetic preganglionic fiber has many axon branches, and it may synapse with 20 or even more postganglionic neurons. And again, they're going to synapse here within that autonomic ganglia. Now, this type or this pattern of projection is an example of divergence. So remember, we talked a little bit about divergence before. And the sympathetic division has a very diverging neural circuit. And this really helps to explain why many sympathetic responses affect almost the entire body simultaneously. So you're able to get that fight or flight response very quickly. Moving on to the parasympathetic division, the cell bodies of the preganglionic neurons are located in the nuclei of 4 cranial nerves in the brainstem. These are cranial nerve 3, 8, 9, and 10. And they're also found in the lateral gray matter of the spinal cord in the sacral segments 2 through 4. So we can see these right here in the parasympathetic division. We can see those cell bodies of the preganglionic neurons in the brainstem there, and also from S2 to S4 down in the sacral component of the spinal cord. Now, axons of the preganglionic neurons of the parasympathetic division will pass to terminal ganglia. Now, these ganglia are found very near or even within the visceral effector. So the autonomic ganglia of the parasympathetic division are found really close to the effectors, which is different from the sympathetic division. Ganglia are close to or inside of the effectors. When we kind of saw with the sympathetic division, those autonomic ganglia of the sympathetic division are found right next to the spinal cord. So they're very close to the spinal cord, quite far from the effectors. Whereas here, with the parasympathetic division, the autonomic ganglia are terminal, which means that they're going to be very far from the spinal cord, very, very close to the effectors. Now, in the ganglia, the presynaptic neuron usually synapses with only 4 or 5 postsynaptic neurons. All of these postsynaptic neurons supply a single visceral effector. And this allows parasympathetic responses to be localized to a single effector. So it's more like localized responses. Again, very different from the sympathetic division, where we saw that one presynaptic or preganglionic neuron synapses with many postganglionic neurons, making a very widespread response in the sympathetic division. There are two major groups of autonomic ganglia, which are sympathetic ganglia. These are components of the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, and parasympathetic ganglia, which are components of the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. Now, the sympathetic ganglia are the sites of synapses between the sympathetic preganglionic and postganglionic neurons. Now, there are two types of sympathetic ganglia. These are the sympathetic trunk ganglia and the prevertebral ganglia. As we saw in the prior slides, the sympathetic trunk ganglia lie in a vertical row on either side of the vertebral column, and these ganglia will extend from the base of the skull to the coccyx. Now, sympathetic trunk ganglia in the neck have specific names. They are the superior, middle, and inferior cervical ganglia. And now, an important thing to note is that because the sympathetic trunk ganglia are near the spinal cord, most sympathetic preganglionic axons are really short, and most sympathetic postganglionic axons are long. So definitely take a note of that, because that is something important to remember. So preganglionic axons in the sympathetic division are going to be short, and postganglionic are going to be long. Again, that's because the sympathetic trunk ganglia are near the spinal cord. Now, that second group of sympathetic ganglia, the prevertebral ganglia, these lie anterior to the vertebral column, and they're really situated close to the large abdominal arteries. In general, the postganglionic axons from the prevertebral ganglia innervate organs below the diaphragm. Okay, now there are five major prevertebral ganglia. I'll probably write them down here, but you'll also see them in those prior slides that we looked at. So these prevertebral, so 5 major prevertebral ganglia. Our first one is the celiac ganglion. Those are 2 words there. Second one is the superior mesenteric ganglia. Our third one is the inferior mesenteric ganglion. Then we have the aorticorenal. It's a difficult word there, but we'll spell it out here. Aorticorenal. And then the renal ganglia will be the last. And again, you'll see these all in the picture of the sympathetic division that we looked at just earlier. You'll see these prevertebral ganglia labeled there. Now, those prevertebral ganglia are part of the sympathetic division, but we do have some specific ganglia of the parasympathetic division as well. So we'll erase this and go over those quickly. If you have to pause the video and write those down, you can definitely do so. Okay, so the preganglionic axons of the parasympathetic division, again, will synapse with those postganglionic neurons in terminal ganglia. So most of these ganglia are located very close to or actually within the wall of the visceral organ. Now, those terminal ganglia will also have specific names. Again, you can see these labeled in the parasympathetic picture that we looked at earlier, but I will just also write them out here. So the ciliary ganglion, number 2 is the pterygopalatine ganglion. Put 3 over here, which is the submandibular ganglion. And our 4th one is the otic ganglion. So again, these are the terminal ganglia in the parasympathetic division. Now, because terminal ganglia are located either close to or in the wall of the visceral organ, parasympathetic preganglionic axons are long, in contrast to the parasympathetic postganglionic axons, which are short. So this is opposite to the sympathetic division. So preganglionic axons are going to be long, and postganglionic are short. What else put here? There we go. So the sympathetic axons preganglionic are going to be short, and the postganglionic axons in the sympathetic division are long. Now, after axons of sympathetic preganglionic neurons enter the sympathetic trunk ganglia, they may connect with postganglionic neurons in one of 4 ways. So they may synapse with postganglionic neurons in the first ganglia it reaches. Kind of our first pathway it could take. So it could synapse with that first ganglion it reaches. It also may ascend or descend to a higher or lower ganglia before synapsing with the postganglionic neurons. An axon may continue without synapsing through the synaptic or the sympathetic trunk, It might go through that sympathetic trunk ganglion to end at a prevertebral ganglion, where it synapses then with the postganglionic neurons. Or it could also pass without synapsing through the sympathetic trunk ganglion and also through the prevertebral ganglion and extend to the adrenal medulla where it synapses there. And there it will synapse with a chromaffin cell. So we'll see those 4 pathways here in this picture. So our number 1 here, we can see our nerve coming out here. This is going to be our sympathetic preganglionic neuron coming from the spinal cord. Number 1 is right here. This is where it would synapse with the postganglionic neuron right at the first ganglia that it reaches, which would be right here. It could ascend here or descend and synapse with a postganglionic neuron either higher or at a higher ganglion or a lower ganglion. It may also continue without synapsing through that synaptic or sympathetic trunk ganglion, and go to that prevertebral ganglion here, where it synapses there. Or it may also continue all the way through the adrenal gland or to the adrenal gland without synapsing, and then synapse with a chromaffin cell there. So those are kind of the several pathways that an autonomic motor neuron can take, specifically the sympathetic preganglionic neuron. Cell bodies of sympathetic preganglionic neurons are part of the lateral gray horns of all thoracic segments and also those first 2 lumbar segments in the spinal cord. The preganglionic axons will leave the spinal cord along the somatic motor neurons at the same segmental level. Now, after exiting through the intervertebral foramina, the myelinated preganglionic sympathetic axons pass into the anterior root of a spinal nerve and enter a short pathway called the white ramus. And this is before passing to the nearest sympathetic trunk ganglion on the same side. Now those paired sympathetic trunk ganglia are arranged anterior and lateral to the vertebral column. Since the cell bodies of the preganglionic neurons of the parasympathetic division are located in the nuclei of 4 cranial nerves and the sacral segment of the spinal cord, the parasympathetic division is also known as the craniosacral division. We could write that down here. And then the axons of the parasympathetic preganglionic neurons are referred to as the craniosacral outflow. This here is the pelvic splanchnic nerve. Now this synapses with a parasympathetic postganglionic neuron that's located in terminal ganglia within the walls of the innervated viscera. So you can see this synapse right here within the wall of the urinary bladder. So you're going to see a really long preganglionic neuron and a very short postganglionic neuron. So you can see these labeled here. Based on the neurotransmitter that they produce and release, autonomic neurons are classified as either cholinergic or adrenergic. Now, cholinergic neurons release the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, while adrenergic neurons release norepinephrine, which is also called noradrenaline. Cholinergic neurons include all preganglionic sympathetic and parasympathetic neurons. Sympathetic postganglionic neurons that innervate most sweat glands. And also all parasympathetic postganglionic neurons. Now, cholinergic receptors include nicotinic receptors and muscarinic receptors. So acetylcholine is going to be stored in synaptic vesicles and released by exocytosis. It then diffuses across the synaptic cleft and binds with specific cholinergic receptors, which are those integral membrane proteins in the postsynaptic plasma membrane. Two types of cholinergic receptors, both of which bind to acetylcholine, are going to be nicotinic receptors and muscarinic receptors. Nicotinic receptors here, these are going to be present in the plasma membrane of dendrites and cell bodies of both sympathetic and parasympathetic postganglionic neurons. So put this here. So sympathetic and parasympathetic postganglionic neurons. They're also found in the plasma membranes of chromaffin cells of the adrenal medulla. And also found in the motor end plate at the neuromuscular junction. Now these receptors are named nicotinic receptors because nicotine actually mimics the action of acetylcholine by being able to bind to these receptors. Muscarinic receptors, these ones here, these are present in the plasma membrane of all effectors. So these are autonomic effectors, so all autonomic effectors I'll specify here. So again, these are going to be smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. There we go. So these are going to be all effectors that are innervated, I guess specifically by those parasympathetic postganglionic axons. So parasympathetic innervated. Now these receptors are named muscarinic receptors because a mushroom poison called muscarine can mimic the action of acetylcholine by binding specifically to these receptors. Nicotine doesn't activate muscarinic receptors, and muscarine does not activate nicotinic receptors. But acetylcholine does activate both types of cholinergic receptors. So kind of interesting there. So here we can see a table kind of comparing the location and responses of adrenergic and cholinergic receptors. Our first set of the table here is just going to show our cholinergic receptors. So our nicotinic versus muscarinic. Now, activation of the nicotinic receptors by acetylcholine always causes depolarization and excitation of the postsynaptic cell. So we're always going to see excitation here. Whereas activation of the muscarinic receptors by acetylcholine sometimes causes depolarization and excitation, and sometimes causes hyperpolarization, causing inhibition. So here we have this table that gives the major locations and also the effects of both types of cholinergic receptors. And then here we have the adrenergic receptors. So in the autonomic nervous system, adrenergic neurons release norepinephrine. And adrenergic receptors will bind both to norepinephrine and epinephrine. Now there are two main types of adrenergic receptors. These are alpha receptors, alpha 1 and alpha 2, and beta receptors, beta 1, beta 2, and beta 3. Now these are found on the visceral effectors innervated by most sympathetic postganglionic receptors. Now this further classification into subtypes 1, 2, and then 1, 2, 3 is based on the specific responses they elicit and also by their selective binding of drugs that will activate or block them. So one thing that's important to know or important to get off this table is that the cardiac muscle fibers are going to be either have beta 1 receptors, beta 1 adrenergic receptors, and the ciliary muscles and hepatocytes have beta 2 adrenergic receptors. Here we have a table comparing the sympathetic division with the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. So remember that sympathetic division is the fight or flight response. And effects of the flight or flight response are things like the pupil will dilate, the heart rate, force of heart contraction, and blood pressure will also increase. Blood vessels that supply organs involved in exercise or to fight off danger will increase. So things like skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, that blood flow to those muscles will increase significantly. This table here shows the differences between those two systems, the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems, shows where they're found, the differences in their axons and neurotransmitters, all things we've talked about, but a good table to know. Most organs receive innervation from both divisions of the autonomic nervous system, which typically will work in opposition to one another. Now, the balance between sympathetic and parasympathetic activity is called autonomic tone. An autonomic tone is regulated by the hypothalamus. Now, the two divisions can affect body organs differently, and this is because their postganglionic neurons release different adrenergic and cholinergic receptors. A few structures receive only sympathetic division. So put these here, sympathetic division or sympathetic division innervation only. These are going to be the sweat glands, the erector pili muscles that are attached to hair follicles in the skin, the kidneys, the spleen, most blood vessels, and also the adrenal medulla. Now, in contrast to the fight or flight response of the sympathetic division, the parasympathetic division enhances rest and digest activities. So here we have that parasympathetic stimulation on the right column here. Now, the parasympathetic responses support body functions that conserve and restore body energy during times of rest and recovery. The acronym SLUD, S-L-U-D-D, actually I'll put it this way, S-L-U-D-D. This can be helpful for remembering the 5 major parasympathetic responses. So this stands for salivation, lacrimation, or producing tears of the eyes, urination, digestion, and defecation. So this is some more responses of the glands, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle to stimulation of both the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system. The whole table that we've gone through so far up until now has all been really, really important to see what the effectors' responses are to each of these types of stimulations. Here's a bit more of a continuation of that table. Again, the sympathetic and parasympathetic stimulation mostly shows what happens here to vascular smooth muscle. In some arterioles, it causes vasoconstriction. And in other arterioles, the same stimulation from the sympathetic division, for example, is going to cause vasodilation or relaxation of the blood vessels. So this whole table in the past couple slides, a really, really good table to know. Autonomic reflexes are responses that occur when nerve impulses pass through an autonomic reflex arc. Let's talk about the autonomic reflex arc. So these reflexes, they play a really key role in regulating controlled conditions in the body. Things like blood pressure, digestion, defecation, and urination. These are all parts of autonomic reflex arcs. So here on the bottom we have the components of an autonomic reflex arc. We have the receptor, So just like the receptor in a somatic reflex arc, the receptor in an autonomic reflex arc is the distal end of a sensory neuron, which responds to a stimulus and triggers a nerve impulse. The receptors in autonomic reflex arcs are mostly associated with enteroreceptors. Remember, these are going to be internal environment receptors. Our next part is a sensory neuron. So this is going to conduct nerve impulses from the receptor to the central nervous system. An integrating center. These are going to be interneurons within the central nervous system that relay signals from sensory neurons to motor neurons. And then we have the motor neurons. Motor neurons are going to connect the effectors with the central nervous system. And then we have the effector. Remember, in an autonomic reflex arc, the effectors are smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. Now, because the autonomic nervous system controls a lot of internal systems, it has a really high control in homeostasis. In the skeletal system, pain receptors warn of bone trauma or damage. In the cardiovascular system, it has a really large control on the heart rate and blood pressure, as well as blood flow. So here we have one of those really great figures where it shows how the nervous system affects homeostasis for all other body systems. So again, here, things like the skeletal system, where we have pain receptors warning of bone trauma and damage. We have things like the endocrine system, where the hypothalamus regulates those hormones from the pituitary gland, and the autonomic nervous system regulates the secretion of hormones from the adrenal medulla and the pancreas. In the lymphatic system, neurotransmitters help to regulate immune responses. In the respiratory system, the autonomic nervous system helps to regulate the diameter of airways. In the digestive system, the parasympathetic division will stimulate a lot of those digestive processes. There's a lot of stuff on this table or on this picture that is really good. Good to know. Good for studying.